Now, if I were one of those more serious video essay type of channels, I would be telling you that the year was 1981. It was the year that Ronald Reagan was sworn in as the 40th President of the United States. Reggae singer Bob Marley passed away at the age of 36 from cancer, and the CDC reported the first recognized cases of AIDS in 5 homosexual men in Los Angeles. But very clearly, I'm not here to talk to you about that. No, I'm here to talk to you about Green Lantern, issue number 143. This issue would see the end of a storyline concerning the Green Lantern, Hal Jordan, and the Omega Men fighting against the Guardianians who had captured both of them. And also included a backup story with Adam Strange being blamed for Alana's apparent death and being called a murderer by the people of Ron. But I'm not here to talk to you about that story either. What I'm here to talk to you about is something different. As you saw from the title of this video, I'm talking about a very specific crisis event. So what does Green Lantern number 143 have to do with that if it came out in 1981 and Crisis on Infinite Earths didn't start until 1985? I'm so glad you asked, because the answer is in the letters column. In it, we find a letter from one Gary Thompson of Dearborn, Michigan, who writes in, "Dear DC, Green Lantern's futuristic epic in 136 through 137 was simply superb. It was a little depressing to learn that the Gordanians will still be buzzing around centuries from now. You mean the Teen Titans are never going to get rid of those pests? What I found interesting was Myra's explanation for why they failed to recognize Green Lantern. And records don't exist before the Great Disaster, which should indicate that Space Ranger and Iona Vane follow the OMAC Commandy Jackson timelines. However, Myra evidently didn't have access to Showcase 100. In their first team up, they do recognize each other. Oh well, maybe JCH can come up with a clever explanation to bail out Marv." The response Gary received went like this. "First off, Gary, if you look at the editorial indicia this month, you'll see an interim change of editors. Len Wein is filling in until new editor Carrie Burkett takes over the editorial reins, while Jack C. Harris moves over to DC's far-flung foreign department. So please address all future correspondence to Carrie, okay? Secondly, timelines and previous meetings. You aren't the only one who mentioned Showcase number 100. Indeed, we knew about it, but we felt a decision had to be made. Any comic that somehow included Angel and the Ape, Scooter, Windy and Willie, and Green Lantern and Space Ranger had to, in our consideration, be put outside all DC timelines. The story was obviously done as a fun get-together, and really should not be considered as part of the DC true mythos. Really, funny animals and enemy ace don't go together unless you take it with tongue firmly wedged in cheek. At least, that's the way we saw it. One day, however, we, meaning the DC editorial we, will probably straighten out what is in the DC universe, excluding that which isn't in direct reference with Earth 1 and what is outside. In the meantime, we'd surely love to hear from you readers, and we solicit your help in this matter. Talk about opening a can of oversized worms. About our timeline, we also mentioned that Space Ranger's time existed after a war which could also tie it in with the Atomic Knights era. See? We're open to all manner of thought. Now, this interaction that we just saw in the letters column is not so different from the type of thing that we see happening online now, where fans try to reason out and try and figure out how exactly different things that kind of clash within the continuity across the many years that comics have been running, they try to reconcile these things and try to make it make sense, but even by doing that, you're still going to run into a situation like this that Gary was talking about, where he knew his continuity, he knew the history of the comics, he knew these characters, and he read a story that didn't really seem to jive with what he knows of their history, of their past interactions with other characters and other worlds, so he felt compelled to write in and ask about that. Now, the reason why I'm talking about this is because this is something that has been mentioned before, and as a matter of fact, Marv Wolfman himself was actually talking about that just last year at a convention. I was able to find this thanks to the Batman universe. In this article, there's a section that says, during a spotlight panel at WonderCon 2024, Crisis on Infinite Earths writer Marv Wolfman revealed the genesis of the story. The crossover that changed the DC universe forever was the result of a single letter a fan wrote to Green Lantern in 1981. I was writing the letter column for Green Lantern, which was one of the many books I was writing at the time. A fan wrote in saying he didn't understand DC continuity, Wolfman said. This line drew chuckles from the crowd. If that 1981 letter writer thought things were complicated then, I can only imagine what they would think about 2024. DC sales at that particular time were not very good, Wolfman continued. Marvel was outselling them at something like 4-1. We needed to do something because DC has many great characters, but they just weren't getting out there. They weren't being done correctly. We were heading to a convention in Pennsylvania, and I'm very deadline conscious. I got to Penn Station to take the train down an hour before we had to leave, and the other people were a little late. I'm sitting there waiting for everyone else to show up so we can take the train to Pennsylvania, and I started thinking about that letter, and how do we fix the continuity? I had an hour before anything else showed up, and I worked out pretty much the entire concept of what Crisis would be, and the storyline, and how it would work. I talked to Jeanette Kahn the following Monday, who was the president and publisher. She loved the idea because we needed something big. We needed to make a real statement that DC was changing and we're doing different types of material. It's no longer the Superman of the 1950s. It's now 1985. Which to me is an incredibly interesting thing, that a letter that someone wrote in to Green Lantern 4 years later, Marv Wolfman was still thinking about that exact letter and thinking, how can I try and fix this? What can we possibly do so that people like that, like Gary, aren't worried about, the continue, something that they can actually follow, something that they can get invested in and not feel like, somewhere down the line they're just going to tell some other story. And it's interesting to me, right? Because this is the thing that kind of comes with calling for changes or wanting things to be explained, or wanting the creators, the people who work at these companies, to try and make sense of something that you're not really sure of as a fan, that something just seems to not really make much sense. This is kind of the risk that you run, right? Because Crisis on Infinite Earths in itself isn't necessarily what I would call a bad story, right? It's not poorly written or anything. It has a very clear through line. You can tell what the purpose of the story was, but at the same time, they're still trying to tell a story within the universe itself and make it make sense. So in that regard, I whether it's a good or a bad story, whether you think it ranks anywhere in the top 10 DC stories or whatever, that's totally subjective. More so, though, I think this kind of plays into the thing of, you have to be very careful what you wish for, because we'll probably never know what Gary thought about Crisis on Infinite Earths. So, I mean, for all we know, he may have loved it because now, things are simpler and easier to understand, or he might have hated it because now a whole bunch of things were just wiped away and we have to pretend like they're not there anymore. So it could have gone either way, but there's really no way for us to know for sure. It seems more so like what Gary was asking for was just for them to do something within like a singular issue, or maybe a couple of issues, to just kind of explain what that one little inconsistency was about, something like that. But what happens is, when you ask for that type of thing, you run the risk of getting something like this instead, of having Marv Wolfman remember 4 years later, oh yeah, there was that one guy who didn't understand how DC continuity works. Maybe we should just destroy everything and condense it down to one storyline, and that way they only have to follow the one universe and there's nothing else for them to worry about. So that would make it easier. Again, we don't know if that's what Gary wanted. For all we know, he just wanted them to like throw something in there like, hey, I forgot, I did know you from our last adventure, my bad, I don't know why I forgot. He might have been fine with that. Instead, what he got was the entire DC universe, or multiverse, whichever you want to call it, being destroyed and condensed down into just one. So why bring this up? Why is this important? Why even talk about this at all? Because like I said, it is interesting how a lot of times we wish that the creators, these companies, would listen to the fans more often. But oftentimes when they do listen to the fan feedback, we don't necessarily get what it is we think we're asking for. And that this is a perfect example of that. Gary just wanted something simple and got something so not only did he get something very complicated in the end. Really, Crisis on Infinite Earths itself isn't so much difficult. What came directly after it immediately got very difficult. And this is the burden of responsibility, I think, for a fan. Now, I know a lot of people think the fans are blameless, that you can never blame the fans because the fans are always correct, the audience is always right, and that is the dumbest shit that I've ever heard in my life. See, because here's the thing. I'm a part of the audience, you're a part of the audience, and we're not always going to agree on what we think should happen in the story. We're not always going to agree on what we think a character should do. We're not always going to perceive the things that characters do or say the same way. One good example of that is recently with the Invincible show. Y'all remember when the first season came out, and a lot of people did not like Amber because she got mad at Mark for not telling him that he was a superhero. A lot of people hated on her for that, but I never understood the hatred for her, because it made perfect sense to me that she would at the very least feel a little bit bothered that he wouldn't tell her. See, because in the world that they lived in, superheroes already existed. So him telling her, "Hey, I have powers," wouldn't have been something so hard for her to wrap her mind around. The only thing she would have then asked is, what are you doing with the powers? What are the powers? That type of thing. It would have actually opened up a whole other conversation. Instead, he kept all of that secret and was also putting his life in danger, which could have also been putting her life in danger without her knowing about that. So yes, I can understand at least feeling a little bit annoyed that someone is possibly putting your life in danger and you don't even know that. Now, as we saw in the response to Gary's letter, he was not the only person to bring up this particular inconsistency. So how many of them actually brought this up, we'll never really know. It may have just been a small handful of people who felt bothered enough by this to actually say something about it, but the result was the same. The result was that all DC's fans had to adjust to this complete change in how their stories were being told, in the way that the universe was set up. They had to adjust to that whether they liked it or not, because you have this handful of people who then put an idea into an editor and writer's head, where now his mind is working, and because he just so happened to have some time to sit down and wait and think, he was able to come up with a story and then basically just go and tell it to his boss, who was like, "Yeah, love it, go ahead, yeah, let's do that." And that's what we ended up getting. That's the risk you run. Now, I know that saying that, it's going to make some people probably think that I'm sitting here telling you that you have to accept whatever story they put out. Doesn't matter how terrible it is, doesn't matter how much you don't like the characterizations or the storytelling or the art, you just have to accept it because you don't work for the company, and if you say anything, you're going to make it worse. So that means that you just have to accept it. That is not what I'm saying. Do not assume that. I'm not saying that you cannot voice your opinions, that you can't even tell the creators that maybe you would have done a story a different way, or maybe something doesn't make sense to you. What I'm telling you is, when you do that, just bear in mind that you are possibly going to end up affecting a change through some sort of like butterfly and or domino effect, where something will end up changing so drastically because of a very minor gripe that you have. So here, I'll give you a hypothetical situation using myself. I do not like that they made Tim Drake bisexual. I'm bisexual myself, but I do not like that Tim Drake is. I refuse to accept that. I do not like it. I absolutely think they need to change it back and just have him be straight. I do think that needs to happen. Here's the thing. Here's why I'm not going to campaign every day on a soapbox or every time I see Tim Drake saying that I think he needs to be made straight. Because I could say that, right? And a writer or an editor might hear it and think that, you know what? Maybe we should consider that. Maybe it's too much of a problem that Tim Drake is bisexual. Maybe it's best if Tim Drake just isn't alive anymore. Why don't we go ahead and kill him off for a while? That way, the heat dies down and people will stop talking about him. And then maybe in the future we can bring him back once people stop talking about him, once people aren't so mad about him anymore. And now, a character that I actually like isn't even in comics anymore because I wanted them to change one very specific thing about him. That's the risk you run. And honestly, it's interesting because I've tried to look at what some older fans have said. It's very hard to get a straight answer out of older fans for some reason. Can someone explain to me what this need is to remind people that there wasn't any social media back in the day? You try to ask someone, just, what was your reaction to it? What did you and your friends think about it? And the first thing they'll tell you is, well, you have to remember, we didn't have social media, so it wasn't like we could get everybody's opinion. Which, yeah, we know that's why we're asking, what did you think? What was your idea? So the few times that I have been able to read some people's reactions to what was going on as far as like Crisis on Infinite Earths, a lot of them, they were fine with it, or they just didn't really understand like what was really happening. They didn't understand the full stakes of what was being done. They didn't realize this storyline is actually affecting everything that's going to be going forward up to a point until they did another one. So that was more so the thing. It's just people didn't really understand what was going on with it fully, but they seemed to enjoy the stories to some extent, and some of the deaths really did kind of affect them, pretty hard. So there was a lot of that, but overall, it really wasn't the biggest deal in the world. Now, since then, the opinion around Crisis on Infinite Earths has I would say ebbed and flowed somewhat, in that it kind of depends when you're talking about it. See, when you're talking about it in the context of DC is resetting their universe again with another, crossover storyline, then people will usually look on Crisis on Infinite Earths with somewhat of a negative view, which is understandable because that really was kind of the genesis of a lot of this stuff. Although that wasn't the first thing to ever be called a crisis, that wasn't the first thing to ever be like a crossover between different universes, but it was the one that, destroyed everything else. So that's why that's the main one. And then on the other side of that, you tend to see a lot of appreciation for the story, at the very least, because it really did try to swing for the fences. It tried to do some very big things to really try and reset all of continuity, in the interest of trying to keep not only, the returning readers interested, but to also possibly simplify things for people who wanted to get into it but wouldn't even have the ability to read even 1% of the back issues that would be needed for them to understand everything that was going on. So it really was, for the time and for what they were trying to accomplish, it really fit what they were going for. But ultimately, we'll never really know what would have happened if Gary hadn't written in that letter. I mean, who knows? Maybe Marv Wolfman would have come up with the idea for Crisis on Infinite Earths anyway, without needing that seed planted into the back of his mind of trying to find some way to simplify all of continuity for the fans who really do pay attention, or who maybe don't want to go back and try and figure out all of the past history. And while we'll probably never really know what Gary thought about Crisis on Infinite Earths, what we can do is salute him for his contribution to comics history, because just by his one little suggestion, he may have possibly planted the seed to something that is still affecting comics to this very day. And quite honestly, I think that's a very powerful thing, to have the ability to influence creators and companies like that this far out. That's pretty impressive. But to wrap it all up, I just wanted to talk about this because I found it interesting, especially because I found it interesting that one person, or perhaps a very small group of people, could go on to affect something so large, so much beyond themselves, in a way that they themselves couldn't have possibly anticipated it playing out. But with all of that being said, I would love to know what you think about all of this in the comment section down below. Feel free to share your thoughts with me. If you have any thoughts of anything else you'd like me to explore in comics history, anything that you've ever been curious about, something that you've ever wanted explained to you, feel free to let me know. I'm always open to suggestions. I'm always looking for new things like this to talk about. Just the parts of comic history that tend to get overlooked or lost just because they're so minute, they're so confined to a very specific period of time, and over the years these things can get lost. So I feel it's important to continue talking about them so that other people will perhaps learn about it and take that and just keep it running with the comics knowledge. That's mostly what I want. But I've rambled enough, so if you are done here, I would appreciate it if you would go and read a book, or some books, plural. That would be great too. If not, then I'll see you on the next video.